Hi everyone, this is a primer on how to work with curves in Maya. We covered most of this information in class, but I thought I'd put together a short refresher on how to create curves inside the software. Now, like I said, you can import curves from programs like Illustrator or anything that is vector-based. Remember, on the back end, anything that is vector-based is basis for any 3D program that exists in the market today. So for this, what we're going to do is we're going to use the front viewport. The reason for that is because we don't draw curves on the perspective viewport because, as you can probably figure out, we have no control as to where the points go in space in this perspective viewport. While if we use an orthographic viewport, we are constrained to X and Y, or X and Z, or Y and Z, depending on which one of the orthographic panels you choose. So you'll know that you're drawing, that your curves will be flat to a specific plane. So let's use the front viewport in this case. Let me maximize that. What I want to do is I want to go ahead and go into the Create drop down, go to Curves Tools, and click on this little double line up here to release that menu and make sure that I have access to all the Curves tools right here. So let's go through the list of the 6 types of curves that we can create in Maya. So we're going to start with the Control Vertex Curve tool, which is CV. We click on that. Basically, what this allows us to do is define a curve by using tangents. So I'm going to click the first point, then a second point, and you'll notice that that second point looks like a little U, and that's because it indicates the direction in which the U mapping would be if I were to use this for mapping. And eventually we will when we go into material creation. Then it allows me to set a third point, and you'll notice that I have not defined a curve just yet. I am simply defining kind of like a hole, whereby I am going to be using tangents to define the curvature. Then after I click on the fourth one, then my curve appears. And that curve is basically the average tangents of all those lines that I have just created. So as I keep on laying down points, you'll notice that the curve is using the average of the tangents of those points in order to define the curvature. Let me hit return here, and you'll notice that my curve now exists. I can go ahead and right click, and I have access to the components that include the curve point, control vertex, edit point, and hull. So the ones that we're focusing on right now are these two, control vertex and edit point. The control vertex is basically any of those points in the hull that we were just defining, which define the shape of the curve. So I can go back in and modify the curvature of my shape based on the position of those points. I can also right click and say edit point. Now, as you define the curvature by creating a hull, you also lay down points within your curve. The more points you have, the smoother this is going to turn into a polygonal object when you do that transformation eventually, when you send this out to be edited in polygon mode. So you want to make sure that you strike a good balance between the amount of segments that you create. These are spans. That's what they're called. Any space between the edit points is called a span. So you want to have sufficient spans for your geometry to be smooth. That's one thing. The third thing is, if I go to hull, I see the original hull that I had created in order to define that curve. So those are the components. Now the fourth component here, which is the curve point, we're going to talk about in just a few. Let me go back to object mode and delete that CV curve. Now the default type of curve that we have in Maya is called the EP curve, and that stands for edit point curve. And that means that instead of doing the hull to create the curve, I'm actually going to use the points within the curve to define the curve. So if I click, and then click again, and then I click again, I am defining my curve by setting edit points in the curve itself. Once I hit return or enter and I right click to go into control vertex, you'll notice that the process that I was following creates, like again, let's go to hull. You're going to see that a hull was created that defined how the tangents define the curve that we drew. So unbeknownst to us, a hull was being created as we were laying down the EP points. So I'm going to go ahead and go to edit point, and you see that I have access to my edit points here. Okay. So it's basically the exact same result with both of the tools. Let me select that and delete that. Bezier curve is parallel or the same exactly as what you see in Illustrator. So if you click and drag, you're going to be defining curvature based on Bezier handles, Bezier points. Once you hit return, if I go and right click and I go to control vertex, you'll notice that we don't have edit points. We have control vertex, and that is because this one gives us access to the actual points that we laid out with their corresponding Bezier handles. So we can go back and select one of the handles and move it around to fine-tune our curves. You can also change these points from these types of handles to corners or Bezier corners. So let's say, for example, I choose this point right here, this one, let's say this one. And I'm gonna change that point, these points, by the way, the anchor points and curves in Maya are called nuts. So this nut that I'm gonna change right here, I'm gonna go ahead and press the Shift key on the keyboard, right click it, and from the flyout menu, I have three options. I can go ahead and change this into a corner, a Bezier point, which is what it is right now, or a Bezier corner. Let's start with corner. So if I go there, you'll notice that I lose the handles, and that point behaves like a straight out point where a line comes in straight into it and the line leaves straight out from it. So that is a point. Now, if I want to go ahead and right click that and go to Bezier corner, this is going to change it into yet a corner, but I have handles that allow me to manipulate the shape of the curve as it accesses that corner. And I can go back to that point, press shift on the keyboard, right click on the mouse, and then go to Bezier, and that brings back the handles that I can control the curvature, the tangent going around that point. So that is how Bezier corners are defined and how Bezier paths are created. So let me go ahead and click delete on that. Now the pencil behaves like a pencil tool. So like I said in class, you just simply draw and that gives you a shape. I personally never use this and I wonder why we still have it. I don't know of anyone who uses the pencil tool in Maya. So I'll delete that. Then I'll go to the 3-point circular and 2-point circular arc. Now 3-point basically does what it says. You have to define 3 points in order to define a curve. So if I click here, for example, and then I go up here and then I click next to the beginning, I have a nice round arc defined by 3 points. The 2-point does the exact same thing, but with 2 points. So I'll click where I start and I'll click the definition point on the other end and I can move that around. I can flip the curve by clicking on this little switch before I commit to the curve. I can go back to the edit points and change the position of them to define where the curve starts or ends. And this gives you a nice piece of information on radius on the element that you're creating. When I hit return, that becomes an object. So that is how the curve tools work in Maya. Now, the one thing that I wanted to add to this conversation, let me close this, is that once you have a curve, say for example, you have defined a curve, and I'm using the EP tool right now. So let's hit return so that this becomes an object. There we go. And now what I want to do is let's go into the control vertex mode. You see that I have control vertices for the hole that I created. Let me right click and go to edit point, and you'll notice that I have edit points in my curve. Now, let's say, for example, it turns out that I needed an extra point in here, or in both areas. I want one here and another one here. How would I go about adding those knots into that curve? Well, to do that, you need to use that other component that we didn't talk about yet, which is the curve point. Now, what the curve point does for you is it allows you to define areas on the curve. You see that little yellow dot that was created by my clicking on and dragging on the curve. That defines a point where I want to do something in this curve. So if I want to do this, and I want to go ahead and shift on the keyboard, press shift, and then right click on the mouse, you have the ability to insert nut. So when you insert the nut in here, watch what happens. When I go back to my edit points, I now have an extra point on my curve. Say you wanted to add more than one at a time. Well, let's go to control curve point, click here, press shift, click whatever you want to add more points. So you can have as many points as you can fit within this thing. Then press the shift key, keep it pressed, right click, insert knot, and then that takes you back to object mode. And when you go back to edit point, you'll see that you have added the extra points that you didn't have before. So you can go ahead and keep on adding points to your curve to better define, and they come along with control vertices. So if I go ahead and go to CVs, you'll notice that I have whole points around my curve for those new existing vertices that I have added to my curve. So that's extremely useful. Now you'll notice that basically as we created these, let me actually, this is a bit busy. I need something that's a little bit cleaner. So let me delete this curve here really quick. What I want to do is I want to create a quick curve with about six spans. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so you'll notice that let me hit return. My curve basically has six spans, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points, sorry, and 5 spans. Now, this curve is very uneven. The distance between this edit point and this edit point and this one, I mean, they're all over the place. So sometimes we want to even out the distribution of our points on our curve for different reasons. You're going to see one when we align objects to a curve. So if we want to rebuild that, your first inclination might be to go back in and say, okay, I need to go to the edit points and I start trying to slide them. But when I slide them, I change the shape of my curve, and that's problematic. Let's say you got the shape to where you wanted it, and changing the position of those points will basically mess up your work. So how do you reconstruct this curve? Let's go to object mode, select the curve, and go to the attributes editor for that curve. This gives you information. The curve shape node gives you information as to what you have going on here. This tells you that you have 5 spans available. So when you do that, when you see that, remember, basically you're looking at this spans, the pieces that we clicked on in order to be able to define the curve. These are the CV, the control vertices. So now, when I want to redistribute this to evenly distance my points, I need to select that object, and I need to go to curves, rebuild, options. Now remember, we saw here that we had 5 spans, so we want our end result to be 5 spans. We can also determine at this point whether we want to have something that matches what we have. We want to smooth out curvature, or do we want to set them at a uniform distance, which is what we want in this case. So when I click on that, I can say keep original to make a copy, and the copy would be the one that has the evened out spaced knots, or I can go ahead and change any number of these settings. I can also say what do I want the parameters to be, whether I want to keep the ends where they are, the tangents, meaning the curvature, the control vertices so that they don't move. I need to define how I want these curve to be rebuilt. So with that done, let's go ahead and click apply really quick and see what happens. You see that there's a slight change in my curvature, not by much, only around here it changed a bit. Let me undo it really quick so you guys can see. There you go. So let's redo it again. Let's change this to 5 spans to match the original and click apply. You'll notice that there was a slight change. Now when I go here and I say control vertices, let me actually activate the whole. You'll notice that every span is pretty much the same distance that from one another, except for the very last one. The very last one is iffy, and I'll tell you why that is. Let's go to control vertices. This is basically what it's the program is looking at as the last control vertex. It's not looking at this one. So actually, sorry, it's looking at this one. It's looking from here to here to here. So it's looking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points. Now you notice that I have one extra here and I have one extra here. The program doesn't look at those 2 points while it is distributing my knots on the curve evenly. It basically disregards those 2 points. The reason for that has to do with, once again, this being the U point, where we're now talking about how distribution of material or mapping onto an object created by this will be based on. So we're going to talk about U and V's in about 2 weeks. We'll start talking about materials. So we'll be talking about that. So let's go ahead and undo this once again and see what effect the other options have in my rebuilding the curve. I'm going back all the way to where I see the change, and there it is. So let's go ahead and say, okay, I want to still keep 5, but instead of changing and keeping the ends, I'm going to keep the tangents, both of them, let's say. So if I click apply, you see a slight change, and let's see the end result here. Okay, so it's very similar. Slight change. Let's say I want to not keep the CVs, but I want to keep the number of spans, not the tangents, not the ends. apply, you see that there's a slight change on that as well. So it gives you options. Let's go ahead and undo that really quick. Go back to ends and say, I want this to be, by the way, the smoother, to get the smoothest curves possible, always work with cubic. If you go to linear, watch what happens. Basically turns off all the smoothness out of your curve. So you don't want to work with that unless that's your intent. And you can also define the amount of, the degree of smoothness that you want on this. Cubic is what maintains the smoothest possible with the least amount of geometry. So you have the ability to do that, to include more knots if necessary, to maintain curvature, to, basically you have the ability to control how this thing is going to behave based on the settings that you have within this window. In this case, you notice that we multiply the amount of knots. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But all of these spans are basically the same distance. So it maintained the curvature as I had it, but it created a new set of CVs in order to give me equidistant points of control within my curve. So that is how you rebuild a curve. And we're going to be using this when we distribute objects along a curve.